Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee workshop. Today we're going to build a teak wet bar. There's a wall cabinet with a mirror backing and glass shelves to display all your glassware. We're going to make retractable louvered doors, something we've never done before. The base unit has room for a small sink, plenty of room for an ice maker, and all your other storage needs. I'll show you how to build one next, right here in the new Yankee workshop. Now I want to start on the base unit by making a notch for the toe kick. I'll make the initial cut with the saw and finish it off with my jigsaw. But before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. I've just made a rabbet along the back edge of one of the lower sides, and that's to receive the back of the cabinet. To do that, I'm using my stacked dado head cutter, which is set up with a 3/4 inch width and a sacrificial strip so the blade won't hit the metal fence. I also need the same rabbet along the back edge of the wall cabinet sides. I've just formed a rabbet in a narrow strip of plywood which is going to go between the sides of the base unit. The rabbet will receive the 1/4 inch plywood backing, but it has a secondary purpose. This cleat is also a nailer to attach the base to the wall. Now that's the dado for the bottom shelf of the base unit. That dado at the top of the side piece is going to receive a cleat, which I'll use to attach the top. This is the fixed bottom shelf of the base cabinet, and this dado is for the center divider. Now I've turned my attention to the sides of the wall cabinet. I've made a dado at the bottom and at the top for the fixed shelves. I've just made 2 dados in the fixed bottom shelf of the wall cabinet. They will receive partitions which conceal the door hardware and support our glass shelves. I've just switched back to the fixed shelf of the base, and that dado is going to receive the front board of the toe kick assembly. I've just run a dado down the center of this cleat, which is going to sit on top of the center partition in the base. I'll cut it to length later. Using my router and a jig, I'm able to make a series of holes which is going to receive the clips to support the shelves. The jig has holes 1 inch on center, and a collar in my router fits into the jig, and a 1/4 inch bit does the work. Okay, now that takes care of the corresponding holes for the pins in the center divider. Before I do any assembly, I want to clean the teak where glue is going to meet the surface with some acetone to remove some of the oil. Now I'm ready for a little assembly. Some glue in the dado, and we're starting with the base cabinet first, putting in the fixed bottom shelf. Just drop it into the slot, make sure it's even, and I'll attach it using some 1 1/4 inch brads, which I'll toenail through the joint. The cleat, or the nailer at the top back, is next. Now this is the cleat that I'll use to attach the countertop later. Now for the other side. Now this piece of 1/4-inch plywood is the back, and that gets glued in place. And that adds incredible strength to the carcass. It stops it from racking. Okay, now I'm ready for that center divider. Goes into the dado of the bottom shelf and nail that in place. And finally, at this point, the cleat that sits on top of the center divider. Nail that in place. The wall cabinet is assembled using the same techniques that I used on the base. I put glue in the dados of the side pieces and slip them over the shelves and then secure them with some more brads. The back of the wall cabinet is a piece of 3/4-inch fir plywood, but you won't see any of that because it'll be covered with our mirror. I'm using glue and 1.5-inch brads to secure it to the carcass. Now I've got this 2-inch wide cleat of plywood, and it's really just a spacer. I'll secure it with a couple brads, and what it's there for is to receive the top edge of this panel right here. This panel slides in the dado at the bottom shelf and goes up against the cleat. That'll conceal the door hardware, and also I'll have a series of holes on this side to support our glass shelves. Now I'm starting to work on our countertop, and for that I'm using some nice thick solid teak, 6/4 stock that was actually left over from a job we did a few years ago. I've jointed the edges so that I'll have a nice tight fit. Now I'm cutting slots for biscuits that'll reinforce the joint. Let's put a little pressure on this, but not so much that we squeeze all the glue out of the joint. Let's set this aside to dry and take some more solid teak and treat the edges on the carcasses. I've machined up some solid teak pieces to cover all the exposed plywood edges. Just a little bit of glue and some brads will hold them in place. Now this is the last piece for the base unit, and you'll notice that I've made a rabbet which fits over the cleats that connect the front to the back of the cabinet. Just set that in place and attach it with a couple more brads. Now it's going to take a few more minutes to finish up the rest of the face frame work, but tomorrow we're going to make a jig that'll allow us to make louvered doors. We'll make a drawer, and then we'll install all the hardware. I think we'll make it. Well, good morning. Today we're going to make some louvered doors. Here's a sample that I made. Our doors will be a bit shorter and wider, but the trick to making a louvered door is finding a way to cut the slots for these slats. For that, I devised a jig. It's made up of 3 pieces of plywood, one here, and one down here, and a couple guides. These guides will actually hold my stiles in place as I mill the slots. Now, if you look down on top of the jig, you can see that there are a series of V's. These would be matched slots for the slats. Now, it would be impossible to cut this out of a solid piece of plywood, but if you make a pair and cut each half, they'll match perfectly. First, I drill a 1/2-inch hole at the drill press, then I clear out the rest of the material at the bandsaw, giving me 2 identical pieces. Now here's the 2 pieces of 1/2-inch plywood tacked together. All my layout is done on the top, and the holes that I want are marked. I have a fence which I have an indicator mark on to align everything, and I just drill through both pieces with the 1/2-inch bit. The slots in my jig are at 25 degrees. Now my miter gauge only tips to 30 degrees. So what I had to do is adapt the fence. I took a piece of plywood and cut it at 25 degrees, attached it to the miter gauge, and then put an extended fence on it so that I could guide the piece through the bandsaw. Okay, now with the pieces separated and a little bit of glue on the back side and where the points meet, I just slide them together, take a piece of 1/4-inch plywood, and tack it in place. Now we add the guide strips to locate the stiles. Now I've just run 2 slots that will receive this 1/4-inch strip of plywood, which acts as a guide to stop the router base. Now there's one more step before I can actually put the jig to work, and that's to route through the plywood backer using a 1/2-inch collar and a 1/4-inch bit. Now before we can put our jig to work, I have to make the mortises in the stiles which will receive the tenons from the rails. And for that I'm using my dedicated mortiser. You've seen me use this before. It has the 1/4-inch chisel. The drill bit does most of the work and the chisel squares it up. Now with the door stiles clamped in the side vise and a mark showing exactly where the top edge of the bottom rail will be, I slip the jig into place. Now I want a slat to sit right on top of that bottom rail, so I move it up until the bottom of the cutout is right on the pencil line. And then I clamp the jig in place. Now I'm ready to route. That's all I can get on that side. Now I move the guide strip to the other slot and work on the other stile. All right, that takes care of every other slot. Now I've just got to re-register the jig by sliding it forward an inch, reclamping it, and repeating the process. All right, let's see how we did. Pretty good. There we have it. A perfectly matched set of door stiles. Now it took about 1.5 hours to make the jig, but I'd say it's worth it because it only took 8 minutes to make the stiles. Here I'm beginning to form the tenons on the door rails. The first cut is the shoulder cut. With the blade raised, I'm able to make the shoulder cut at the top and the bottom of each rail. That completes the top and bottom of the tenon. And finally, the cheek cuts, which completes our tenon. The material for my slat starts out as 1/4-inch thick, 1 1/8 inch wide square stock. To round over the edges, I'm simply using a 1/4-inch diameter beading bit. Here I've beveled the top slat to meet the rail at 25 degrees. Well, now for some assembly. I've put glue in the mortise and tenon joints of one side, and now I just put the slats in dry. This one is the beveled one to meet the top rail. The others just slip in. Now I can slip on the other stile, and it takes a little bit of patience to get all those slats lined up. All right, there's one, 3 more to go. Now I'm ready to start building the drawer, and it's going to be made up of 1/2-inch plywood with an applied teak front. This setup allows me to make a groove in the sides and the front for the plywood bottom. That dado is going to receive the back of the drawer. The sides of the drawer box are going to be joined to the front with dovetail joints. I've cut the tails in the side piece. Now I'm going to flip my jig over, mount the front on the top, and cut the pins. Okay, now that should take care of the pins. Let's see how the joint goes together. That's good. All right, now for a little assembly. Glue on the tails and in the pins. We just tap it together. There's really not a better joint to put together drawers. All right, now for the bottom. That just gets slipped in place and nailed along the back edge. And then we'll put the hardware on. Okay, now that takes care of the corresponding track that goes in the case. We'll slide the drawer in. That's good. Now I'm ready to put on the drawer front, which I'm just going to glue on and attach with some brads. All right. Now I'm just going to take the drawer front and put it up against that box. Take a spring clamp and clamp it, and when it's perfectly centered between the rails and stiles, tack it with some brads. Now for the other side of the cabinet, I'm going to have a false drawer front because we have a sink going in here. So I've fitted a piece of teak so that it's snug. But in order to show the same reveal as the drawer, I'm going to have to make a little rabbet around 3 sides to give me that shadow line. These plywood blocks will allow me to permanently attach the false front. Now all I have to do is set it in place and put a couple brads through the plywood. Well, now I want to finish up the toe kick on this base unit, and I'm putting a couple pieces of scrap plywood in the groove that I made earlier. And that's simply a backup so that the toe kick can't get pushed in. Those pieces are just glued in place, and then I'll apply a little glue to the cleat and install the toe kick piece. Well, now I'm ready to work on the countertop, and I want to dress the surface of it. And if you're fortunate enough to have one of these, a wide belt sander, that's the way to get the job done. Okay, now I'm going to change my belt to a finer grit, moving from 80 to 120. I've just jointed one edge so that it's straight and square. Now I'll rip it to width. Okay, that's the first step in the cross-cutting operation. I now have one end perfectly square. Okay, that makes the other end square. Now if I spin it around and trim off about 1/8 of an inch, I'll have the other end perfectly smooth. To treat the edges of my counter, the first thing I'm doing is rounding over the front corners. Then I'll radius the top and bottom edges with a 1/2 inch rounding over bit. Now we'll flip it over and round over the underside. This piece is going to be the backsplash. I rounded the top corners, and now I'm just putting a radius along the front edge with the same bit I used on the counter. Now I just attach the backsplash with a few screws. Well, now we're ready to install the pocket door hardware in our wall cabinet. And it starts out with 2 tracks, one that gets mounted at the top and one that gets mounted to the bottom by simply attaching it to the side with some screws. Now they tell you to join the top and bottom tracks with a strip of wood. I'm using some plywood that was left over, and attach that with some screws. Now I drill a 35mm hole in the door to receive the hinge. All right, well that takes care of the wall cabinet. Looks pretty good. Now on the base unit, the hinges are installed using the same methods as I did on the wall cabinet, but I don't think I'll put those on now. I'll finish the sanding and get some protective finish on the piece. For the finish in our teak, I'm using a wipe-on poly. It'll give me a satin finish. But before I put any of this on, I took the time to wipe the piece down with acetone, just as I did with the glue joints. And what that does is removes the surface oil from the wood so that the polyurethane will have a good bond. What I'll do is put on one coat, let it set for about 8 hours, and then apply another coat. And that should be all I need. Well, what do you think? I know what you're thinking. Why did we install it here in the shop? Well, we had a little available wall space. It's here for display purposes only, no recreational use. I just finished installing the lighting package, which includes a couple low-voltage halogen lights in the upper cabinet, which will give us light for the glasses, and a couple more under here, which light the work surface. I've installed this hand-hammered brass sink and a nice high faucet. Down below, we've slid in an ice maker, so we're all ready to make plenty of ice. Now, the next thing to do is to install the mirror, which goes in the back of the wall cabinet, and that's just going to set in there and be held in by the partitions that are on the side. So, once I get it in place, I'll slide in the partition and attach it with the screw. Okay, now the one that goes on the other side. These are just more of that teak plywood. Now we'll put the glass shelves in. Now the glass shelves are 1/2-inch thick glass, and our glass shop simply polished the edges to give them a nice finished look. Now to conceal the wires from the lighting package, I have a wooden shelf. It has a couple cleats on the bottom, which will give it a space. Slide that into position, and that completes the upper cabinet. And you know, that mirror in these glass shelves really make it a nice glass display case. And the doors close it all up. Now, this was a real nice project to build.